It's easier to find if you do it on your computer.
I find that too. Just do it on a computer and upload it to YouTube unfiltered is the easiest, I find.
Okay, yeah, that's what I just did. Perfect. All right, thanks, Charles. Yeah, so yeah, let me get started. So pretty much the use case for this that we wanted to get going was some customers wanted to create a job. They had a build job already running in Jenkins. And what ended up happening is they didn't want to migrate all that to GitLab into a GitLab CI file. So they wanted the job to build in Jenkins, for example. And then if that build were to be successful, then we would continue on in the pipeline. But if that Jenkins build would fail, then we would show a failure on GitLab and not move forward in the pipeline. And that way we don't have to run all these excess tests if a Jenkins job failed. So we wouldn't continue down. So is that correct, Cindy?
Right. The idea is there's customers that want to use our security capabilities, but they want to continue using Jenkins CI.
Okay, yeah. So exactly. So if Jenkins CI were to fail, then we wouldn't run the security scans. But if Jenkins CI were to pass, then we'd continue on, run the security scans, and then we can even do CD via Jenkins, or we can do CD via GitLab. So you can integrate Jenkins at any point in the pipeline.
Yeah, I'm curious, Fern. So you're saying if Jenkins pipeline fails, then we don't even run the scan. But what if we run the scan and we find critical vulnerabilities? Do we send something back to cause the Jenkins pipeline to fail?
So no, not necessarily. So the Jenkins pipeline. So the way that it works right now is if a build were to fail, right, then you wouldn't move on to catch the security scans. But the security scans can run then, and then they can cause the build to fail, and then you wouldn't continue on to the next step. So you can do it however, you can configure it in any order. So
if you found a critical vulnerability, you could tell Jenkins not to.
Correct. You can tell Jenkins not to run any further. So it all depends just on configuration scripts that the customer can write. And I'll show you that now. I'll show you it in the build stage. So let me share my screen. Okay. So can you see the Jenkins interface?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I created this Jenkins pipeline, or Jenkins job to be more accurate. And the way that I configured it is, so it does say GitHub project, but that's just because of Jenkins wording, but I was able to connect my GitLab project, which I have hosted in this URL, and I set the GitLab connection to GitLab Core US. So for source code management, this is just basic setup that I'm just going through how a customer would set it up. They would set up the repository URL and the credentials, and I'll try to get something up. The demo systems has a good write-up on this, but I can probably make it more, nice and customer centric. So that would be set up. We wouldn't set up any build triggers because there's nothing that's going to trigger. We're going to trigger this job from running manually from the CI, from GitLab CI. So this wouldn't be configured. In my build environment, I just have secrets like my CI registry password, where a customer would create a service user which would have all these things on there. So this is just for testing purposes. And so here's my actual job that I have in Jenkins. So in this job, what I'm going to do is on any error, I'm going to exit out with an error exit code. And all I'm doing here is just I'm building my container and then pushing it to my Docker repository. And then I'm exiting with a 0 to show success. And then in post-build actions, using the GitLab plugin, I'm telling it to publish the build status to Jenkins. So that's where you see the actual external job come and run right after the job is successful or failed. And it'll link to the Jenkins job. So now to show you that in action, show you the job running in action, then I'll go in the GitLab CI files. So let's run a pipeline. So CI/CD pipelines. And I'm going to go ahead and run a pipeline on master. So remember, this pipeline is going to run this right here. Wait, so I'll add exit one later so you can see it actually failed. So this is a success case. So you see that the build job kicks off. And what the build job is doing is it's running this custom Python script that I wrote that just triggers the Jenkins API. So what it's doing is it's running this Python script that is calling Jenkins, is starting the job, and then is polling for the job status. So it'll keep checking the job status to see if the job, has failed, or if it's still running, it'll keep checking it. And I added a timeout to it. And if it's successful, then it'll show the result as successful. So now that it's succeeded, we'll go back and we'll refresh, and we can see that now the security scans are running. And if you look at the external job, now popped up because it published the build status. And if we do click on the external, we'll get to the Jenkins job where we can see the actual job that ran and the output that came out from that job. So, and now just to show the error case, if we exit one at the start of the job, so we're just going to throw a failure to start with. If I go ahead and run the pipeline again, so it's going to trigger the job, and then the job will automatically fail, and then you will see that none of these security scans will run. And this can be done in the same order. We can also have, like, let's say the next job would be a deploy job. You can do this. You can have this. If any of the scans fail, then we won't go to the deploy job. So, and that's what the customers are mainly looking for, right, Cindy?
Right. But the
Okay.
deploy would be back in Jenkins.
That's what I was just going to ask. So does that do the same thing as you did with build, where it kicks off a Jenkins job for
Correct.
the deploy? Okay.
Correct. Yeah, it'll be exactly the same. The ordering is up to the user, but it'll be exactly the same. So you can, and I'll show you that in depth in the ci.yaml file.
Can you go back to your first pipeline that passed? So the security scans weren't done running yet when it output that job that was after in the stage after that?
Yeah, this one right here.
So that external, that external completed before the tests completed.
Yes. So external, the only thing external is just because of this right here, because of this post build action. But there can be different post build actions named differently, and they'll just pop. An external job will always pop out at the end. It doesn't actually run a job or do anything. It's just posting status, so it's not really relevant to. It's just so you can go back and check the status of the Jenkins job easily, but it doesn't do anything else.
I see. Okay.
So you can have multiple. You can have like 10 different ones with different names. So see how this one called the build name is Jenkins. I can name it Jenkins-build, and then I can name another job Jenkins-deploy, and I can name a whole bunch of different post-build actions, and then all those external jobs will show up at the end.
It might be good to clarify this with Jenkins status, and then it's clear what that is.
Yeah, like it could be Jenkins build status, right? And then I can save that, and then whenever I run, whenever I run it again, and next time I run it, it'll save it as Jenkins build status, and then there'll be one for deploy status.
Would it make sense to have that in the stage prior to the tests?
So the thing with external jobs is you're not able to do that yet. So it'll always show at the end, no matter what.
I see. Okay, that was always confusing me, but that makes sense. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So this, you can see that it failed, and then in the latest pipeline, and now none of the scans were run. So none of the security scans were kicked off because the build actually failed. So, and then you can do the
And what triggered the build to fail? It was because it failed in Jenkins, so it showed up here, right?
Correct. Yeah. So
Okay.
since I put since I just put it to exit one, a failure status, then it just failed. So if any of these things were to actually throw a failure, like I put the wrong password or something, it'll throw a 1, and then the job will fail.
Got it.
And so now to show a little bit more of the technical side, in the ci.yaml, you can do these things where you allow failure which can be a Boolean value. So if you say allow failure equals false, for example, in the security scans, I can say allow failure equals false. If any of those tests were to actually fail, then we wouldn't move on to the next stage in the pipeline. So that's the way that you can configure it. So for the case of you want the scans to run first and then do the deploy job, what you would do is you would have your deploy job, for example, and you'd run your script, but and the deploy job would be in the stage after the test job, for example. And what you would do is in the different security scans, you would say allow failure equals false. That way, if any security scan fails, you wouldn't move on to the deploy stage. But then if you did get to the deploy stage, then you'd run the script that runs the Jenkins calls.
And so failure in the context of a security scan, are you just talking about like that just failed to actually run the scan, like it didn't properly execute? Or I mean, because the other side of a security scan is that, you know, you may have vulnerabilities that you don't want to pass, but it comes back and you might want to fail against, like, hey, I found the crit vulnerability, that's considered a failure. That this is just literally talking about the job not operating correctly though, right?
That's a good point. I thought that it would show red. I thought it would show red if there was
No, it will show past as it was correct. Even if it finds any type of vulnerabilities, it's always going to say the job itself ran correctly. It just gave vulnerabilities that may be not acceptable to the client's criteria, right?
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, so it would be if the job itself fails. It doesn't throw a failure if it actually finds vulnerabilities.
Can you make it do it? Because I mean, we're capturing that somehow, because if we have a critical or high vulnerability, we can require an approval. So I know we're capturing that information somehow. Is it a matter of just changing the variable that you're interrogating?
I'll post on secure and I'll ask. There has to be some way through the API that it can probably be like another script that through the API that just checks exactly what was processed.
Okay. Yeah, because that's really the requirement, is based on the vulnerability findings.
But that's a setting on the pipeline itself, isn't it? I mean, that's a setting that you would set up a security group for approval, right? Depending on if there's critical or high vulnerabilities.
More of an approval process thing. So it doesn't really correlate very tightly to the pipeline job statuses. I think that's one of the kind of confusing parts for customers right now, I think.
I see.
Yeah, I think we need to figure that out and walk through that.
Yeah, it feels like we need to have some sort of threshold that, you know, checks the severity levels of the findings of all the jobs, and if it you know is above whatever their threshold that has been defined as part of the job, then it fails that based off of that, even if the job passed because it operated correctly, right?
Yeah, that's what I would imagine.
Fern, you might want to get with Nicole. I think she's done some work on that with the white source integration. So she might have a quick answer for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll give Nicole a chat after this.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say about that specifically is that I think this because the way we do it inside GitLab, it's okay because it still goes through a merge request and you see those vulnerabilities listed there. Now, if we're talking about this in context of Jenkins, now all of a sudden you start to make that a little bit confusing because you're not seeing that as necessarily as part of a merge request anymore because you're doing that.
Yeah, that's true. So if I see that you're running the scans, where do the scan results show up?
So let's go to another. So let's show a merge request actually.
But do you get a merge request kicking it off this way?
Yeah, you can. It'll kick off even if you just make a merge request. So I was just showing a view because I just committed it myself and just ran it on master. But you can do it the same way with a merge request, and you can see it like this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. What would be if someone was going with this model where they needed to use Jenkins, would they be using the flow through the merge request, or would they? I mean, that's where I'm
So that's just depending on the use case. Most likely they would be using, if they're using GitLab for source code management, then they should be using a merge request flow, and that's where the approvals can be set up. But but it'll continue on in the pipeline because that's just an approval, right, for the end result. It's not an approval for blocking at a certain point in the pipeline.
Yep.
So that'll be one thing I have to figure out. I mean, I'm for sure it can be done by polling something or accessing the API through like a separate job. The thing is, is that one thing that we want? Is a little bit too hacky having another job that accesses the GitLab API to look at the vulnerability status, or is it something we should push to the dev teams?
Yeah, and I feel like the ideal state here that would be kind of the minimal viable change here would be that we incorporate another security job that runs after these security jobs in a subsequent stage that then goes and checks the artifact report of the scans, and based off of the variable that's defined in that job of what is acceptable level of criteria, they could fail the job, so that no more of the process continues on in the pipeline, and still will show the results in the merge request, but you just don't have to run those extra build steps. So maybe a review app or whatever else may happen inside that merge request pipeline.
Gotcha. And that would be something for the development team that we would.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Sorry to kind of sidetrack this a little bit, but that was kind of top of mind there.
All right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And then one last thing I wanted to show was kind of how you can achieve calling Jenkins. So this is like a little script that I wrote that pretty much what it does is it compares Jenkins' last build number with the newest build number, and I added a 2-minute timeout. And what this ends up doing is it keeps checking for what the last completed build is, and it checks if it's equal to the build that it's supposed to be on, so the newest build, and then after that, it'll keep polling the result. And and if the result is not equal to success, then we exit with a failure. If it is, we just exit. And the customer would write something like this in order to determine the status of the Jenkins job to see if they should move forward or kick it off, or exactly what they need. So this was just for the start. This is just like if running the security scans is dependent on the Jenkins job passing or failing. But if they just wanted to kick off the job, they can just use the Jenkins API to just run this command where they'll just build the job and start it. And Jenkins has APIs in all different languages. It's just a simple script that you need to write to trigger it.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask a question in terms of how a user would apply this. So would I have to set it up for every pipeline, or would I set it up, like if I wanted to tweak the rules in the YAML that you showed, would I have to do that for every pipeline or for every project, or could I do it for a group as a template? Because what I'm thinking is it's easy to do this, but what's the scope upon which it's applied? Because it might be very difficult if I have to redo it for every project.
Yeah, depending. So if every project has a different job, right, then you would have to redo it, for every project, because it's job dependent. So you might be kicking off a different job in each pipeline. Mm-hmm. And in that case, then you will have to, you can definitely do a template and probably write like a Helm chart or something or something in Ansible or something to automate and just change the names. But since the names are unique, for example, for the jobs, mm-hmm. that would probably be the only change that you need to make. So it can definitely be templated.
Well, the reason I ask is it's great that we can do this. At the same time, I worry about, do we make it so simple that then people don't have an incentive to leave Jenkins? But I think the incentive to leave Jenkins is twofold. One is we can automate some of that if they'll use our CI. And the other is, in terms of auditability, You know, if you don't really want a developer going in and being able to change the YAML file to say pass everything, the security people would have a fit about that. So if they set it up in GitLab, then it's all auditable and trackable and so forth. So I'm thinking that's the carrot to get them to move.
That, and that you don't have to manage a whole Jenkins deployment, because that is a
Sure.
pain to have to manage, you know, 2 different sets of infrastructure and
Yep.
all
Yep. Okay. Well, Fern, this has been great. Thank you for doing it. I'm wondering if we should stop recording for a minute so we can talk about how we might use this for that RFP that we've
that.
got.
Yeah, let me stop recording real quick. Again. 1 second. I don't even know how to use this. All right.